The death of my husband was unexpected. He was never sick. He didn't have a weak body or heart. He was healthy, and his family had a track record of living up to 90 years. It made no sense that he was hit by a truck in the middle of the road. But what could I do? His corpse was already buried. It was hard to remain in the house we shared. Never mind that the rent was too much of a burden for only me to bear. The memories that surrounded me choked me, and I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I searched for someplace else, and soon I found a suitable house. It was small, and it matched my budget. The only thing that didn't feel good enough to write home about was the weird news I heard on the day I moved in. I was exhausted from packing and unpacking. After the long day, I decided to breathe some fresh air in the garden behind the house. Not exactly behind the house. The garden belonged to the owner of the house behind the new house I rented, and it was a lovely sight to behold. I got out of my house and pushed the back gate into the garden of my neighbor. If there was a functioning back gate, it meant that I was welcome. At least, I wanted to believe that. It was impossible not to be mesmerized by the roses that greeted me as I entered. The beautiful string of colors and flowers delighted my eyes. I was dancing through the garden without even knowing it. It felt like heaven, until a deep voice called me to order as I neared a darker and choked-up part of the garden, drawn by a strange smell. "You wouldn't want to go to that part yet," he said. I looked over my shoulder and glanced in the direction of the pretty voice. It reminded me of what novel writers deceived as husky. His muscles smiled at me through the sleeves of his shirt. His face was curved into a tiny smile. I was quiet and almost forgot all about my dead husband, just staring at my handsome neighbor in his brown eyes. I almost understood why women fell at the feet of men. He seemed to have been made right out of a romance novel into reality. He shook his head before my brain did a reset, and I introduced myself. He didn't seem so glad to see me, or maybe it was because of the side of the garden I was headed to. I extended my hand for a shake, but he withheld his. "You must be the new person." Something about the way he said it was cheesy, but his handsome face made me forgive him so fast. That didn't hold up for long. "You must have heard the myth about the apartment you rented." "What myth?" I would have asked, but he continued so rudely I wasn't interested anymore. He rambled on about how the last 4 tenants who had occupied the house in the past 6 months went missing without any trace. Truthfully, the agent who told me about the house communicated something like that, but I couldn't be less interested. I didn't care. I wanted out, and the house was a nice deal. I didn't even mind if I was missing after a while, too. Anything that would make me forget that I had a life without George in it was fine for me. When I got tired of the rambling, handsome man, I said goodnight and took the back gate back into my own house. I promised myself never to go there again, no matter how beautiful it smelled. I couldn't hold the resolve for long. I was back there the next day, and the day after, and the day after. I even started to tend a small part of the garden, hoping that grumpy Mr. Handsome, who refused to share even his name, would not find out that I was stealing a part of his garden. I still found it weird that a man dedicated so much time to the pruning and development of such a beautiful garden. I knew because I watched him through the window in my kitchen when he attended to it, first thing in the morning and last thing in the evening. I stole into the garden at midday or midnight when I was sure he would never be there. I couldn't have known he saw me or watched until another day when I was tempted to check the darker part of the garden again. It was only my 2nd month in my new house. I stole into the garden at midnight, as usual, hoping to clear my head and escape from the nightmares that disturbed my sleep. But the longer I stayed in my usual spot, the more my nose was disturbed by a foul smell from the choked-up part of the garden. I tiptoed and was at the entrance in little time. I wondered if that was where he kept the fertilizers and manure he used for the garden. and was soon met by several ancient boxes. Goosebumps crawled over my skin. I felt like a pirate who discovered a treasure. The foul smell in the garden hit stronger as I moved closer to the boxes. It smelled like something rotten. I lifted one of them, and the sight that hit my eyes drained every iota of blood left in me. I gripped one of the trees to garner the strength to stand. I crawled out of the garden and raced back to the gate that led to my house. Thank goodness I brought my phone with me. I dialed the number in a rush. I didn't hear anything as I stepped in front of the gate and tried to open it. It was locked. I didn't lock the gate. I couldn't even if I wanted to. I banged it, wondering how it locked itself. I didn't need to wonder much longer, as a voice behind me made me shiver. "I see you have discovered my lair," he uttered. And I wondered how I ever thought that his voice was sexy the first time. "Welcome, Ms. Helen. It's your time to join them." I screamed and banged harder at the gate, shouting for help. It was useless. Everyone disappeared. I remembered his narration the next day, and I shook as his footsteps drew closer to me where I stood behind the gate. I pleaded that he should let me go. I said I wouldn't tell anyone, but he shook his head. The blade in his hand shone, and the only thing that saved me that night was the sound of sirens and the entrance of detectives. He raced away, sensing that he wouldn't be able to finish up before he was caught. The officers found the garden and found me shivering and shaking. I led them to the lair while they explained that they heard my plea for help from the emergency call I made. I'd forgotten about the call. They traced the phone number and found my location. I couldn't help but be thankful. Grumpy Mr. Handsome was never caught. The detectives tried to identify the bodies that were found in those boxes in the garden, and I traveled to another town. I moved in with my mother and hoped to forget my husband there. I was about 11 years old when my parents divorced. They had absolutely hated each other. They never seemed to stop at the fighting, the arguing, the shouting, and the person who it affected the most was me. My mom managed to win custody over me based on my dad's drinking issues, but we were originally quite poor. So, with the loss of half the household income, we should have been in a state of pure poverty. But according to my mom at the time, our luck had turned around. Days after the last papers went through in the final stages of the divorce, my mom met a man called Harry. Harry was incredibly wealthy. I even managed to find out about their relationship after I saw my mom come home each night wearing a new set of expensive jewelry. And every time I would question her on how she got the money, she would always answer with a shallow grin, then told me to go to bed. Eventually, I was able to meet Harry. We were moving into his house, after all. He was a tall man, about 6 feet in height, and radiated confidence and wealth alike. His hair was slicked back, and he was always well-dressed. To me, it felt like he was covering for something. His house was a colossal structure, containing several master bedrooms, and was ornately decorated with marble pillars. Though I was always one to notice the cracks. I would point them out, too, only to receive a deathly stare from my mom, followed by an eerie chuckle from Harry. In just a couple of nights, I started growing in my urge to discover who this man really was. Especially as one thing he refused to say continued to haunt me, causing me countless restless nights. I needed to know. The question I repeatedly posed to him was, "Where does all your money come from, Harry?" To which he would grow a dark glance in appearance, and my mom would retort with, "Don't be rude, John. It's inconsiderate to ask people about money." I knew my manners, but I also knew when someone was lying. He would always answer with the same dark glance and ignore it. What was he hiding? I began to explore the house, walking round the gleaming corridors at night, attempting to discover the detestable underbelly of this glamorous abode. Yet I could never find anything. That was the case at least until one day, whilst Clambering past an old painting left on the side of the wall in the corridor, I noticed my steps seemed to echo only when in the area adjacent to the painting. I paced backwards and forward past it, testing if my theory was true, until I decided to take a look behind the painting, which bore an odd resemblance to Harry, and gave an even more extreme facade of true wealth. Lifting the painting up ever so slightly, I noticed a beam of light shining through a rather large gap in the wall. Realizing that suddenly I had found something, "What do you think you're doing, Jonathan?" A foul voice echoed from behind me as I jumped out of my skin, swerving my head round to see who called for my name. It was one of Harry's butlers, or rather, one of his slaves. The butler's face looked wrinkled and bruised in areas, and there came a lifeless aura about his eyes as I spoke to him. Nothing. I saw this painting here and thought I could try lifting it back onto the wall." He nodded, and he grabbed the other end, and in one swift action, we lifted it back onto the wall. I thanked him and pretended to move away, only to scuttle back moments later as I heard his steps fade off into the corridor down the other end. I darted back over to the crack, peered through. I felt my body seize up in fright. Through the gap, I was bearing witness to several women, all locked in cages, with camera equipment lodged all over, with their lenses set on the captives. There were countless wounds, scars, bruises that were scattered over their bodies. Their mouths were taped shut, hence why I never heard them before this. The rest of the room was lined with clubs, bats, whips, chains, and a whole assortment of different weaponry, all capable of delivering torture to anyone they could reach. I fell back in shock, and the walls around me felt like they were warping into smiles and grins alike. I was thrown into a state of pure terror, and so I reacted just as any other 11-year-old would have, and sprinted back to my room with tears flooding my eyes. I laid in bed that night, thinking only of the poor, tortured souls that were hidden behind the marble walls and fake smiles. Then, I remembered my mom. I leapt out of bed and threw myself into a full sprint down the corridor to find my mom's room. We needed to get out of there quick before she became a prisoner too. I slowed down as I approached the room, just so Harry wouldn't hear me if he was in there with her. Unfortunately, as I snuck closer towards the bed frame, standing over my mom's empty bed, stood Harry, with a bloodied hatchet clutched into his arms. My mind fell into a trance. Did he hit my mom? Did he put her in the cave as well? Was she alive? I could feel nothing aside from all these crazy thoughts running across my mind. It truly pierced me with such a morbid reality that I simply couldn't cope. And as I lost feeling in my legs and hit the floor, I too had just doomed myself to an eternal silencing of my life. Hearing the thud of my back hitting the ground, Harry swiveled round, bearing a demonic smile as he slowly crept up towards me, bearing the hatchet in his arms, raising it high, ready to strike. You know, John, I always wanted a son. The hatchet he was gripping came down on my legs, severing them from my torso. I screamed, but only internally. My body had completely shut down. And although I could feel my veins being lacerated by the metal axe, I could make no attempt to flee. And endurance seemed to be all I had left in this life. He took me to his study. He injected some narcotic into my bloodstream, filling it with a sense of drowsiness. And ever since that day, I've been sewn to this wretched wheelchair. Then, been forced to tell the story repeatedly into one of his little cameras that he then sells to vermin like you on the dark web. He'll be here soon. If you're reading, watching, or listening, please stop buying this. Let him end my suffering. I can't go on any longer. Please, help!
My name is Roger, and I am 44 years old now. I used to be a soccer player on a professional level. I even played in Europe for a while. I was smart and responsible enough to save and invest enough money so that I could have a comfortable life after retirement, which in this kind of job happens very soon. I kicked my last official ball when I was 41. This was only 1 year after me and my wife got divorced. We were happy enough, but sometimes things end when they end. Plus, we had a son, Andy. Since I was retiring so young, and my wife Phoebe, who was only 32, still had many plans and goals to pursue in life, it was decided that Andy would live with me. In spite the usual visitations and vacations with his mother, etc., the usual deal. I had money, I was young enough, and I was retired. But I had a son, and I was going to raise him, at least for the most part, by myself. Andy was 9 years old by that time. Back then, we lived in an apartment. Big and pleasant enough, but I thought that it was time to move on, leave the past behind. Me and my son needed new memories, and what better place to start another chapter than in a new house? After a couple months of searching, we finally found a house that pleased us both, father and son. It had 2 floors and it was close to the beach. "Dad, I love it here," my son said in his first night, when I was kissing him goodnight after he went to bed. "I'm glad you do, Andy. I think we made a great choice. We'll be very happy here. Sleep tight, son. Pleasant dreams," I replied before turning off the lights. After 1 month, though, I soon realized that I needed someone to help me with all the endless domestic tasks. I had time, but I definitely didn't have the skills or experience. I decided to hire a housekeeper who would be in our house 8 hours per day, like a normal daily job. I interviewed quite a few women across all ages. There was one, however, that was particularly nice and had experience with children. She was a Russian immigrant named Svetlana. "Your references are very good, Svetlana, especially for someone so young, 28 years old," I said. "Thank you, mister. I came to the United States when I was 23, and I already had worked in Western Europe as a full-time housekeeper. I also took care of children and even elderly people," the young woman answered. Andy seemed to like her a lot, even since that first meetup. Svetlana did have one of those empathic personalities. It was easy to understand how she was good with people and children in particular. Her English was also very good. "Very well, thank you for coming. I will contact you within the next week, whether I'm interested in your services or not. I never leave people without an answer," I said, being sincere. "Thank you, sir. That's good to know. I will be waiting for your word then," she said, before leaving. As expected, it wasn't hard to make the decision. Andy also agreed that Svetlana appeared to be a great choice. "She's very beautiful, Dad. I can't wait until my friends see her, when she takes me to school or when they come here to play with me," Andy said. "Boys will be boys," I thought with a smile. Within 2 weeks, Svetlana was working in our house. She quickly adapted, as did we. She arrived in the morning and would prepare breakfast. Then sometimes she would take Andy to school, while other days I made it my job to take him. Svetlana would return in the afternoon and do all sorts of chores. She would also go shopping and she cooked. By the time she left at 5 p.m., everything was perfect. I just had to heat dinner a couple of hours later. And of course, usually on the weekends, she had her days off, but sometimes we would change her schedule. Months passed by and everything was perfect. Me and Andy were happy, also going out a lot. Dinner, movies, etc. We also visited my ex-wife, Phoebe, who is living and working in another state. "You both seem to be doing great. I'm almost jealous of that Svetlana. I can't wait to meet her. And also your new house. Through the pictures, I can already tell I'll definitely like it," Phoebe said. Eventually, I started dating other women. Svetlana would stay home with Andy during those few nights. This only happened once a week. I was paying her for the extra hours, of course, and since she was still single and didn't have her family in the United States, she didn't mind. It was now 1 year since Svetlana came to work in our house. I needed a special favor from our housekeeper. I wanted to go out for a whole weekend. I was dating a woman for a while, and I wanted to take things to another level. "It's just for 2 days, Svetlana. I'll leave on Friday and come back on Sunday in the afternoon. You can have Monday and Tuesday off," I said. "Very well, mister. I'm happy to help, and I enjoy spending time with little Andy," she replied. and so it was arranged. I had a great time in that weekend with my girlfriend Daphne. When I returned home Sunday, I was even excited about the idea of talking to Andy about her and to arrange for them to meet. No one was home. I assumed they had gone for a walk. It was still relatively early, but after a couple of hours, I was starting to worry, and I called Svetlana's cell phone. It was turned off. My son also had one. I called Andy. It was also turned off. I panicked and contacted the police and answered all their questions. Svetlana was now being persecuted by the authorities. 3 months later, there was no sign of Svetlana. But my son, Andy, was found dead, ironically on a beach. For some morbid yet logical reason, it was an outcome that I was expecting. With grief in my heart, I had to contact my ex-wife, who now hated me from the core of her heart. That day, I got a call from the police. They had found some vital information regarding my son. I hurried off to the station. "I'm afraid we have some very disturbing information. Please sit down," the detective said, as I sat down in front of him in his office. We conducted an autopsy, of course, and we made a gruesome discovery. Some of your son's internal organs were removed, including the heart and the 2 kidneys. It's a safe assumption that your housekeeper is a part of an organ trafficking organization, and after gaining your trust, she waited patiently for the right moment to act. I'm sorry. We will keep looking for her. Hopefully, at least we can bring her to justice sooner or later. I couldn't even react properly to the detective's words. I still can't.
My family moved to a new city and to a new house. Mom was the giddiest about our move, and she often spoke about how much of a steal we got our house for. I wondered why we had to steal a house to live in it, but I never asked anyone, and I suspected that no one would listen to me anyway. But I heard my dad tell my mom that the old family who had lived in the house had passed away in a fire. The last family had been there all but 3 days. No one else but my family would touch the property, as it was cheap. Dad called it an unfortunate string of incidents because no one had suspected of arson. Dad swore to be careful, and Mom assured. I was pleased with the house because it was big, and I had a bigger room in the new house than I did in our old house. The house creaked when you walked on it, and I liked to walk on it because the noise made me happy. We had a big backyard, twice the size of our old house at least, and I could afford to bring my friends over to play, my mom said. I missed my old friends as I was all alone when we had to move from our old neighborhood. The old neighborhood was too far away from any of my friends to visit us, and I was new in this neighborhood, so I didn't have any friends to play with. Mom said I would have no trouble finding friends because we had a beautiful new house. She said it would be a surprise. In our first week in the house, I found a friend in my room. He had the most curious eyes, and he was as tall as I was. His arms were bigger, and he walked around with a stocky stride. I sensed that he was short, but I didn't know many short people. He was dressed in a fanciful black shirt that could easily blend in with the night, and he stayed quiet as I walked into my room with my toys in my hand. "Hello there," he said to me. He was seated on the floor where my toys were, but I saw that he didn't touch any of them as they had been left the same way from where I had left them. He asked me what my name was, and I told him my name, Richard. He said it was a beautiful name for a handsome little boy like me. "Are you my friend?" I asked him, smacking my lips to think that my mom had brought a new friend for me to play with. "Your friend?" His curious eyes darted in the orbs, and his lips trembled with an answer which I willed to be positive. "My mom said I would get a new friend. Did Mom ask you to come play with me?" I asked sternly, as I seized a long inhalation to catch myself. "Oh, yes," he stammered without hesitation, and he brought himself up from his kneeling position and started to walk to me. I asked him for his name, and he said it was Donald. Donald was not 5 years old. He had the type of hair that Dad had on his face. Donald was nice to me, and he smiled when he walked to me. "Would you like to play with my toy?" I said, offering my hands out to him in charity. His hazel eyes fell onto me with a flatness, but I wasn't afraid. He was not taller than me, and he was nice. "Sure. Where are your parents?" he asked, and grabbed my squishy toy. He held it up to his nose and sniffed it. Then he stuffed it into his mouth and bit into it. "Upstairs, ready to go to bed." "Hey, careful," I squealed. "Honey," Mom called from across the hallway where the bedroom was. "What's going on in there?" Donald looked into my eyes and shook his head. His lips moved and he said to me softly, "I am fine, Mom," he dictated to me. "I'm fine, Mom," I said it back to her. "All right, sweetie, go to bed. It's your first day of school tomorrow," Mom belched from across the hallway. "Do you want to play a fun game?" Donald said to me, rolling my toy on his fingertips. My innocent 5-year-old eyes trained on the toy as it struck the floor and chirped noisily. Donald placed his calloused hands on my face and guided my attention back to himself. "It's nighttime, and Mom says I have a day at school tomorrow. Will you come with me to school tomorrow?" I asked. "We're friends now, aren't we? Would you not want to play with your new friend?" Donald asked me, and I was convinced. My eyes glowed, betraying my simpleness, and he smiled. "What game? I have toys," I said. He shook his head and put his hands out. I looked into his hands and my face flushed with nervousness. I chugged on my saliva in my tiny throat. He outstretched his hand and insisted. Then I took it. When my hand was in his, Donald said nothing, and he walked me to the door of my room and looked at me. I took the cue and I reached out my idle hand to pull over the hinge. The door opened quietly, and Donald pulled me in after himself. His march was brisk, hurried, and I had no idea why he was walking so quickly until we got to the end of the hallway. It struck me that my new friend knew all about our house, but I insufficiently articulated the comment anyway. "This is my house, and nobody gets to keep it but me," he said nonchalantly as he moved blindly into the direction of the kitchen, guiding me after him, and my stomach roared with appetite. I assured he needed food, and he asked me, "Turn on this one." I placed my hand on the black knob of Mom's cooker, and it snapped in the direction that he insisted. The surface fizzled, and then nothing happened. My mind reeled in wonder as I assumed what game it was that we were playing, so I asked him. Donald was walking away from me, inviting my step behind his by looking backwards one time and beckoning. "Come, turn this one too," he said. I walked up beside him and turned on the electric cooker. The sudden blast of a switch did not invite the heat of the kitchen that I always felt when Mom cooked, but I didn't think too much of it. When I had done as he asked, Donald smiled at me and grabbed my hands. "Let's go outside," he said to me, and immediately we were on his march. I followed after him towards the door in a daze, unsure of what I was doing. Donald led me across the street with my hands firmly in his when a loud bang rocked the night. He then let go of my hand. It was the last time I would see my parents or Donald.
My name is Douglas. I'm 53 years old. I have a small shop in which I sell sportswear, clothes, sports shoes, also some bodybuilding items. Last year during Black Friday, I also took the chance to make some good business, which was precisely what happened. I was very happy with the outcome. Great profit was made, especially because we sold products that are already waiting too long to be bought. Back then I had 2 employees, Dexter and Marcello. They were both excellent professionals. I also had a wife, Prudence, who's 10 years younger than me. When I arrived home after that busy Friday, I was tired but happy to speak to my wife. It was a success. Lots of work, but totally worth it, I said to her. I'm glad to hear that, honey. Now finish your late dinner and then let's go to bed. You need your rest, my wife said. That's the best idea I heard all day, I replied, finishing the fine meal that Prudence had prepared for me. The next day when I woke up, it was already 3 p.m. Of course, our shop was closed, and obviously my wife wasn't in bed with me. For sure, her day started a lot earlier. I was just glad that she kept quiet and didn't wake me up. I definitely needed that extra rest. I went to the bathroom to take a shower. I shaved and brushed my teeth. When I got out of the bathroom, I noticed the house was still very silent. I realized my wife wasn't home. She went out and didn't return yet. Nothing strange, I thought to myself as I prepared myself a cup of coffee. What was odd was the fact that the newspaper was nowhere to be seen. This was something unusual. I called Prudence to check on her. Her cell phone was off. When it was already 10 p.m., my wife was still away, and I tried her phone several times already. Worried, I went to the police. There wasn't much that I could tell them, just a classic case of a missing person. Did you try calling the hospitals nearby, her friends, relatives, co-workers? The police asked me the usual questions. Actually, not really. It didn't even cross my mind, I answered. Do so, please. Keep in touch within the next 48 hours, Mr. Murray. If your wife's still missing, we'll then open a file on her and start an investigation, they replied. It seemed fair enough. That night I called several hospitals, not just from our area. I also called everyone that I could think of that knew Prudence. Since my wife didn't work outside home, she had no co-workers or bosses that I could contact. No one had seen Prudence since the last 24 hours. More days went by, and my wife was now officially a missing person. We didn't have any sons or daughters, so I was now dealing with her disappearance on my own. But show must go on, right? This meant I had to get back to my shop. The fact that I was the boss and the owner didn't allow me to take time off, especially after that profitable Black Friday. There was a lot of work to do. I also told my employees Dexter and Marcello about what happened. They were very supportive. I'm very sorry to hear about that, Mr. Murray. I don't really know what to say, Dexter said. If the authorities are already working on the case, the best thing to do is wait and pray, Marcello replied. I thanked them both. My hopes were not very high, though. Nevertheless, I was still going to receive some unexpected news, and definitely not the kind that I wished for. During the next week, I went to the bank, and I was stunned when I found out that half of my savings were missing. Already under enormous pressure, I made quite a scene. What is this? I was robbed! I demand an explanation! Within a few moments, I was now speaking to the manager in his own office. Mr. Murray, I'm very sorry, but your wife just came here last week and she simply took that money with her, cash. Both y'all allowed to move that money, as you must remember. Mrs. Murray said that you were going through a lot of work and needed that money to pay some additional bills, and that you were also going to open up a new shop. I didn't ask any questions since both of you are our clients for 20 years now. When I heard those words, I snapped. Just too much. I didn't hurt the bank manager, but I destroyed his office while screaming like a maniac. Of course, security was called. And then the police too, as I was taken under custody. Not for long, though. Next day I was out of jail. The authorities were very comprehensive, and the bank's manager as well. My wife was now being pursued as a criminal who was missing. In all, she had taken $60,000 with her. Money that I needed to keep the business flowing. The half that I still had wasn't enough. Also because I needed it for my own personal expenses. Health insurance, houses, we had 2, cars, etc. I had to let one of my employees go. Don't worry, Mr. Murray, you can let me go. Dexter needs the job more than I do. I mean, he's older, I'm young, and I was thinking of going back to my country anyway, Marcello said. He was a Colombian citizen. Thank you for understanding, Marcello. I'm sorry. It was great working with you. You're a good man and you will be missed. Best of luck, I said. At least this decision made it easy for me. I sold my houses and bought an apartment. I also sold my cars, which were expensive, and got a modest one. Step by step, I was able to pull myself together. But as time passed, I got super obsessed with the idea of finding my wife. Tired of waiting for the police to give me answers, I hired a private investigator. A woman, actually, named Joanne Moon. And within 3 months, I was summoned to Joanne's office. "I have something to show you," she said on the phone. Burning with excitement and curiosity, in less than 1 hour, I was in Joanne Moon's office. "We found our wife. And her friend. You can see for yourself, Mr. Murray," Joanne said as she showed me a collection of pictures. I didn't even say a word when I saw what and who was in the pictures. My wife, smiling and having fun on the beach. But she wasn't alone. Marcello was with her. In some pictures, they were kissing and holding each other. I understood immediately what had happened. I felt stupid and betrayed. The American police was informed of all this, but since Prudence and Marcello are living in Colombia, my only hope is for them to return to the United States so that they can be brought to justice. Unless I travel there, take justice in my own hands.
Miss Mount? I regarded the man before me with a shrewd expression. I had learned to be wary of men. It was the one thing my mother instilled in me as I was growing up. I was born into a rich family. My parents owned a chain of companies in the city that was later passed down to me after their deaths. They died in a car crash. The news was a devastating blow for me, but I had to pull my big girl pants up and take charge of the company. I had a lot of opposition and had to weed out the dangerous and power-hungry people who I knew would stop at nothing to bring me down. Due to this fact, a lot of my employees either feared or hated me. That was why I was wondering why one of them was approaching me. "Yes?" I asked. "What do you want?" He introduced himself as Steve and said that he was in the marketing department. I was impressed with how he carried himself. He was quite handsome and sounded intelligent. He was telling me about a new strategy that the company could use to boost sales. I listened to him and had to admit that his plan made a lot of sense. I smiled at him and asked him to meet me in my office the next morning. When he knocked on my door, I asked him to come in, and he greeted me with a smile. I was surprised with how much I was attracted to him. He was confident and had a great sense of humor. I found myself wanting to spend more time with him, and I would call for him so we could discuss company issues. It was just all a cover because I wanted to be in his presence. He told me about his past life and how tough it was for him growing up. Being used to wealth, I couldn't understand how his family raised him to be a gentleman. He said that he needed a fresh start, and that's why he decided to start working for me. At work, we kept our interactions purely professional. I wanted him to experience a lot more than he had, so I took him out for dates. I noticed his discomfort whenever I brought something for him or paid for our lunch or dinner, and I would always reassure him that I didn't care about it. There was still a little voice in the back of my head telling me to be careful. I found myself falling in love with him. He was patient and gentle, and I started to imagine a future together with him.
Steve started to sleep over at my house, and I would have asked him to move in if I didn't feel like it would have hurt his pride.
3 months went by, and Steve proposed to me. I said yes, and I felt like the luckiest woman on earth. Steve had made me forget my previous relationships and how badly they had ended. Although we both agreed to keep everything a secret from those at work, we knew once we were about to get married, we'd have no choice but to tell everyone. About 2 weeks after he proposed, we were at my place, about to watch a movie that Steve had picked. The movie was about a married couple who kept having quarrels and fights. They later got resolved when the rich wife transferred all the property to her husband. Steve apologized profusely and swore that he didn't know the content of the movie and he only picked it because it had a good rating score online. He looked genuinely sorry, and he told me that he wasn't asking for anything. He said I was the only thing that mattered to him. Later that night, after Steve went home, I kept replaying the movie in my head. What if Steve and I ended up like that because I'm richer than he is? Even though Steve told me it didn't matter, people would talk and it might affect him. He might even begin to see himself as less. I wouldn't let that happen. I finally found someone that I'm willing to spend the rest of my life with, and I wasn't going to jeopardize that. The next day, I put a call through to my lawyer and I finalized the arrangements. The only things I kept for myself were the company and my parents' house. All the other properties now had Steve's name on them. I have a surprise for you. I squealed when I met Steve that night. We were on our way to a museum. He regarded me suspiciously and I told him that he had nothing to worry about. I gave him the documents and beamed at him. I watched his comprehension change his face. With a choked voice, he asked me why I did it, and I replied that it was simply because I loved him. He hugged me tightly and I exhaled in relief. A part of me had been worried he wouldn't have liked what I did. We stayed out for a couple more hours before we headed to my place. Steve told me he couldn't stay with me and had to go home. Oh, okay. When do you think we should go out again? I asked. Steve chuckled. Never, Lisa. I frowned, wondering what was going on. He shook his head slowly. Want me to spell it out for you? You've been duped. I felt my world crashing as Steve laughed at me. He told me he was never serious about me and he only wanted my money. He was a gold digger and I couldn't believe that I fell for his act. I couldn't stop the tears that ran down my face. I started to think that it would be different than this. Oh, Steve, you've messed with the wrong person. The smile on his face froze as mine grew. No one will ever find you, I said, laughing maniacally. Steve didn't know that those documents were fake. I had wanted to really transfer those properties to his name when my lawyer told me to test him out with fake documents and see if his love was genuine. And apparently, he failed the test. I was thankful that I listened to my lawyer. I removed the stun gun that I always carried with me in my purse and I shot Steve in the chest without thinking twice about it. He dropped to the floor unconscious. I could hardly wait for him to wake up and find himself behind bars alongside other men who only wanted me for my money. They were all locked up in the underground bunker, and everyone thought they were dead. It was true what my mother said. Men were evil and should be treated as such. Who knows, maybe one day I would find a good man that I can settle down and live a happy life with.
But till then, I will comfort myself with the men I keep as prisoners, and I knew they would be there till they die.
Almost 3 years ago, back when I was 16, a mere teenager in the face of the horrors that persisted me, I was forced to bear witness to a type of dislocated reality with a morbid sense of unease at what truly happened that day. It was something I could never truly understand, and in all honesty, I couldn't imagine that I would ever have wanted to. The damp morning sky rose dimly as the queue of waiting heads poked and roused above one another, trying to get a glimpse of where the line ended. We were all eagerly awaiting the opening of our local supermarket for the Black Friday sales. All of our eyes were set firmly on the clock that towered above the cobbled road we all stood on. The clock had to strike 7, and then the storm of people rushing in would entail. Everyone murmured and whispered. Questions were being raised as to when the store would open. Even some more terrifying ones that at first seemed harmless, but gradually increased in their depravity. I heard this store is making everything free. The manager apparently died and the employees want to sell the store to raise money to pay for their houses. I thought it was odd that the employees would even be allowed to sell the store. Unless they were related, perhaps? You know they were family, right? This isn't some random supermarket chain establishment. It's run entirely by a family. The man standing next to me subtly shivered in response to what we both had overheard. But soon enough, I too was left wondering just how much a backstory this place really had. I heard the manager's kids killed him for the inheritance. People only want money these days. People are even starting to value it over family. This time I stood back in surprise. The rumor sounded just as fake as any old school rumor would be, but the dark undertone that resided in the man's voice that spoke it haunted me. All of a sudden, there came an eruption of sound from the clock face. It was 7 a.m. The glass doors suddenly reared open, and then came the stampede I had been preparing for before the rumors had distracted me. A surge of people went flooding in through the gaping set of doors, seeming to disperse amongst the aisles and rows of the store, not really knowing what they were looking for, yet still trying to find stuff to buy whilst the prices were so low. For myself, however, I had other plans. The previous day I had been examining everything in the store to find the most valuable item and then dash for it once the sale would actually start. After only a few hours of searching the endless rows filled with saturated goods mixed in with the odd can of beans every now and again. But right towards the back of the store, hidden amongst the crowds of groceries, there stood a flat-screen TV. That was what I should have arrived at after pushing my way through the bustling mass of people roaming throughout the store. But upon reaching it, I found only an empty shelf with a sign below where the TV once was, reading, "Sold out." My heart dropped and I began to turn around to leave the floor, feeling drained from the very bottom of my soul. All at once, the lights went off. The once booming store fell dreadfully silent, and every sound that was once there had been snuffed out by the sudden arrival of darkness engulfing the surrounding area. I was only slightly nerved when it first happened. My spine tingled, trying to tell me something was wrong, but I was too concerned with the loss of my flat screen to truly care. So I started walking loudly down the aisles. The further along the aisles I went, the louder the silence seemed to grow. At first it was nothing more than an awkwardness about the lack of sound, but it sparked darker images in my imagination that I couldn't seem to just shake off like any other nightmarish thought. I started hearing a pumping noise. It sounded like some disorderly heartbeat, which wasn't my own. I started speeding up. My adrenal glands started urging my body to sense the distress of danger appearing to lurk around me. I had been walking for a good few minutes now, and the door to leave seemed not an inch closer. I decided that something was following me, regardless of whether that was true. I broke into a full-on sprint for the exit doors. My footsteps landed each with the sound of one earthquake after another. If anyone or anything was in this store, it had my location practically pinned at all times. Fear was engulfing me, and I felt something chasing behind me. What could have just been the echo of my footsteps pacing along the floor felt like a scuttling creature hounding me as I ran. The door still appeared the same distance as before, so I could do nothing more than increase my pace even more. Then came a scream that bellowed all throughout the store. It may have just been inside my head, but my voice broke into a shriek of its own. Mortified of the reality around me, this monstrous-sounding creature must have been almost upon me by the time I could feel my energy fading. I could feel my heart about to give out as I used up the last portion of energy that remained within me to finally, just in time, pierce through the open doors, out onto the street outside. It was dark outside. My mind was thrown into a warped sense of being as I tried to fathom what had happened. Morning to night? Creature? People? Where were all the people? Lights. I couldn't bear the thought of such an amass of questions all at once. It seemed to strike the nerve within me so deep I passed out from pure disbelief in my experience. I woke up in my bed a couple of hours later. I was fully clothed. My legs ached and my throat burned. Whatever had locked me in that store, it wasn't natural. It wasn't human. The morning after I woke up, I looked at the news and found that the Black Friday sale had been a huge success. But my eyes began to water and my skin began to seize as I read how the manager was there upon the opening. And there was no such family running it. Whatever had happened to me that day, it was either all in my mind or a darker presence stood with me in that queue that day. I never returned to that store after that. I couldn't risk being entrapped in a false reality ever again. My mind was mine, nobody else's, and I would ensure it stayed that way from here on out.